So we're going to go ahead and get started here. I'm going to introduce our speaker. My name is Dr. Brian Briscoe, and I serve as I'm a private practice psychiatrist in Louisville, Kentucky, but I serve as the chair of the Psychiatry section of CMGA. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this hour, Dr. Samuel Thielman. Dr. Thielman is an adjunct professor of psychiatry, adjunct associate professor of psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke University School of Medicine. He is also a life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and consultant to government and international non-governmental organizations on issues involving behavioral health care for global workers. Dr. Thielman received his MD and PhD degrees from Duke Universities, and he's published very widely on issues involving traumatic stress, global mental health, and disaster psychiatry. From 1999 to 2015, Dr. Thielman was a foreign service psychiatrist for the U.S. Department of State, and in this capacity, he worked in East Africa, Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East. He served as the director of the State Department Mental Health Program in the aftermath of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And in my experiences getting to know Dr. Thielman, I can think of no one who's more equipped to speak about the issue of resilience and more informed on this topic in our field. So it's a great joy and pleasure to have him serving in this capacity for us today. So,
situation and why I decided to get interested in resilience. So, as Brian mentioned, for a long time I was a psychiatrist for the U.S. Department of State. I've been actually living in the Asheville area. This is my home. I live in Montreat, and I was in private practice here. And this was in the late 90s. I was under a lot of pressure. Managed care was coming in, and a friend called up who asked if I'd be interested in this job with the State Department. He was a friend of mine who I'd known for a long time, and I'd been a little bit jealous of him, for his job. And so I said, yeah, I think I would be. So I interviewed for the job, and when I interviewed, they asked a lot of questions about what I would do if I was in an embassy bombing, okay, and how I would manage it and so on. This is in 99. And so, anyway, I thought, well, that's probably just what these psychiatrists do for the State Department. And then, toward the end of the interview, I said, well, where would I be stationed if I worked for the State Department? Like, do you have any ideas where I might be located? And they said, well, we do have an opening in Nairobi, Kenya, okay? And so I thought, I knew some missionaries who were there, and I knew they kind of had giraffes and stuff, and it seemed like it might be good. So, and then I thought for a moment, I said, isn't that where there was a bombing a few months ago? And they said, well, yes, it was, and that would be a part of your job there. And as it turned out, it was a huge part of the job. And so I went over there, and I went with my family, I have a wife, and I had 4 kids living at home. And so we went over and did the job. I learned that they had specifically requested the survivors of the bombing who were very angry at the U.S. government response that they not send a new hire to this job. But they accepted me pretty well, and I was certainly well-meaning. I wanted to help, and so in the end, it worked out pretty well. After that, I ended up. I stayed there for 3.5 years. After that, we went on to Washington, where I did a job as the chief of crisis response. And while we were in Washington, we invaded Iraq in 2003. And so they asked me, since I was relatively low on the totem pole, if I would be able to go over and scout out the Coalition Provisional Authority and see what kind of arrangements were needed for the people who were located there. So that was in the green zone. So here's some slides just kind of showing. So, I'm sorry. Anyway, so Yeah, so I said, okay, and so I'm not a military person, and no one in my family, except some uncles, has ever served in the military. And so, anyway, I got all suited up, went over so we got on this C-130 and flew into Baghdad, and it seemed very unsafe to me, actually, because there were no seatbelts, really. And so we're just sitting on this webbing and whatever. And,
This is resilience? Yes.
Anyway, I won't get into all the details, but we went there, and so here I am by the Tigris, there in Baghdad, and we were coming about the time that they were taking off these big heads of Saddam Hussein off of the Republican Palace, they called it, which is where Coalition Provisional Authority was located. And there's my friend Ray de Castro in front of these, palace doors. I'm just showing you this because I thought you'd find this interesting. Some guys came up to him and said, like Saddam's sons had all this stash down in the basement. You want to see it? And it was like, sure. And so, so they went down there, and this was where, I don't know if you remember the famous Uday and Kusay, but they stored their gifts for the girlfriends down here. So they had a lot of boom boxes, because I guess, they would give you a boom box if you went with them for a little bit. And then they had these Yadro figurines and, bottles of whiskey and whatever, and these guys were demonstrating these big swords, and it was all very fun. And then here we are standing by this big head of Saddam Hussein. So you can see, like, it was a very surreal experience. I mean, this was almost like, it's like, you're kidding. I mean, it's like, it's hard to take in, and so on. So when I was in Nairobi, in my region, I also learned I would be covering the whole region there, not just the city of Nairobi. And so Rwanda turned out to be in my region. This was and so shortly after the genocide. And again, this was one of these things that hadn't really registered very well. I mean, if you remember in April of '94 when the Rwandan genocide was, Newt Gingrich was, trying to take over or something, and Monica Lewinsky was in the headlines, and it wasn't that big, it wasn't that big a production. I mean, it seemed sad, but it just seemed like another, African tragedy. And then when I got there and started visiting the embassy and started looking, it's like, this is like the Holocaust. I mean, this was horrible what had happened. And so, because just to kind of, in summary, this was a place where 10% of the population was killed in 100 days by their neighbors, a lot of times with just, machetes and so on. So this was, at the time I was there, I won't show this very long, but they were collecting these bones for this memorial that they were building in downtown Kigali. So I'm showing you this to show you that despite the fact that I was relatively new to the psychiatric treatment of trauma, I treated a lot of veterans, in my residency who were Vietnam veterans, but beyond that, I hadn't really done a lot as a psychiatrist on trauma. Pretty soon, I was kind of thrust into this, and I learned a lot of things, both personally and clinically. And one of the things that struck me most was that people responded differently to these traumatic situations. And you couldn't really predict very well who was going to respond how. So later on, during the decade of the 2000s and then the 2010s, the State Department got interested in the concept of resilience. So toward the end of my 16 years with the department, I worked pretty heavily on this topic of resilience and resilience training and how to help people prepare for hard times. So that's what we're going to be talking about as we go forward. I'm also going to mention a little bit the concept of different types of traumatic stress, because I think physicians are often subjected unexpectedly to things that produce something similar to PTSD sometimes. So just to give you an idea of what, how the concept of PTSD even came about, I wanted to just kind of run through this very quickly. It's not a particularly old concept in psychiatry. You know, some things like melancholia or depression, this has been talked about for a very long time. And mania is something that's been talked about, you know, since Hippocratic writings. But PTSD certainly hasn't. The first discussion along these lines was in 1866, and it was in the context of railway accidents, because there was interest in compensation for victims of railways. So people would have these traumatic injuries, and then there started to be a discussion by physicians about traumatic stress, that was psychological stress that was experienced around the injuries. So I'm not going to go through all the history here, but just Charcot, who was a person who was influential on Freud, talked about traumatic hysteria in France, and in Germany, this guy Hermann Oppenheim talked about traumatic neuroses in the 1880s. So there was sort of this building, interest. And then in the 20th century, in World War I, this concept of shell shock or nervous shock was formulated. There's a lot of skepticism about psychological distress and traumatic stress. And in World War I, a lot of people were considered cowards if they became very unsettled in combat. And I think people were sometimes shot and discharged and so on. As time went on, though, people pretty quickly understood we're being cruel, to a group of people. They're not really cowards. They can't, they're not able to help some of this. In World War II, things were more sophisticated, and people talked about war neurosis. This was more during the psychoanalytic era. And then our current concept of PTSD really grew out of the Vietnam War experience and the traumatic stresses that people had after that. So DSM-3 in 1980 was the first time that the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was entered into the psychiatric nomenclature. So, and then again, this isn't going to be a talk about PTSD, but it's relevant to resilience, because resilience is why not everybody gets this and what you can do to maybe protect yourself some from this. So in DSM-5, the criteria are you've been exposed to a traumatic event, and that traumatic event can include repeated hearing of the stories of a traumatic event. So that's important, because I think that's where people who work in emergency rooms and physicians can themselves inadvertently become vicariously traumatized by hearing about this or seeing stuff, just seeing mangled bodies and so on. So there's a traumatic event, then you have intrusive thoughts about the event, and you avoid reminders of the event. So maybe you wouldn't want to see a news story or a movie or something that had something like that in it. Then this is another kind of newish elaboration. There are negative alterations in cognitions and mood, including memory gaps and so on. But this can be a negative worldview and just kind of a cynicism that you can see that there can be sort of an overlap with what looks like burnout. Then there's an alteration in emotional reactivity. Often there's a numbness that people get with PTSD. So I remember one guy at the State Department who was with diplomatic security, whose job had been to go out into the green zone, into the red zone, which is where it was very dangerous in Baghdad, and kind of scope out what was safe for Americans. And when he came back to the U.S., unexpectedly, he started perceiving that there were terrorists in his office building in Washington. And so he was sent over to me for evaluation. At the time, I was working on medical clearances in the State Department. So it's like, and I interviewed him, and I'm thinking, well, he probably has some prior psychiatric history or something, but he didn't. He wasn't a drinker. He didn't have a prior psychiatric history. He'd just been so affected by this that he developed these symptoms. And his most prominent symptom was that he couldn't feel love for his family anymore. And so, so I think this blunted emotional reactivity can be one of these symptoms from PTSD, and I think maybe that can explain sometimes how physicians react after let's say, responding to some big event or something. And then there's got to be a duration for more than 1 month. So here's one other thing I wanted to mention, because when I first started in Nairobi, there was more of an impression that if you had been exposed to a trauma, then you were pretty much going to get PTSD, and you needed some kind of counseling and so on. And the more this has been studied, especially in the light of 9/11, because since that happened in New York and Columbia's there and so on, you can really look at this carefully. The more this has been studied, people are aware that, well, that isn't really the case at all. And so, when I was first in Nairobi, the treatment that was the best way you should approach things in a disaster was to go to organize critical incident stress debriefings. And then everyone had to do this, so everybody at the embassy had to do this, the military had all these people trained, and they did it, and so on. Subsequent research showed that didn't really change PTSD at all. Like, there was no difference in people who got that or didn't get it. And in fact, some people were made worse by critical incident stress debriefing. And so starting around 2003 or 4, with this big meta-analysis that was published in the Cochrane Institute studies, the Cochrane group studies that of this critical incident stress debriefing, it was more or less abandoned over the next few years. So we don't do that anymore. But there are other ways to approach it. The second thing I wanted to mention is that in meta-analyses of people who've been subjected to intentional harm, only about 40% develop post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? So this is like military work. And then of that 40%, only 40% of those actually develop chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. So lots of people don't, okay, but some people do. And then getting the people who develop it the help that they need is important. So now I want to move forward a little bit in talking about stress in physicians, how I think what I've learned in my work might be helpful. So here's some concepts to think about: just stress, distress, and post-trauma stress, and then compassion fatigue, vicarious traumatization, and then resilience. So first, let me divert another moment here and talk about this so-called cycle of caring that's been developed by Scove, Holt, and Trotter Matheson. These are two psychologists at the University of Minnesota. So they say in the caring professions, including certainly doctors, there's a cycle of empathetic attachment to the patient, then active involvement, so you're really trying to help. Then there's a leaving or separating once the crisis is over. So we're not really talking about, chronic primary care here, but maybe, something has happened. So then there's a separating. And then there needs to be this kind of personal recreation or restoration if you're going to do this successfully. So I think it can be a real problem if you just have this repeated cycle of attachment, involving, leaving, separating, and then nothing. You see, there has to be some way of restoring yourself so that you can give again. And that's what resilience touches on. So just challenges of working in the healthcare environment, and Steve Sartori really talked about this a lot, but here's my little rendition of this would be the critical incidents that we face, the way that our organizations function, chronic stressful work, and then issues of leadership. And I think poor leadership can really be traumatic. In fact, I'll just say that when we organize these out briefings for people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and in the out briefings, we were trying to screen for PTSD and get people who needed help the help that they needed. And so I often ask, well, were you ever in an area where there were rockets or, gunfire or anything? Were you exposed to danger? And they would say, oh yeah, we had that, but that, Doc, we know what you're fishing for. That didn't really bother us. The worst thing about my situation was the horrible leadership that we had. That really made a mark on me. And I've heard that enough times that I don't think you can really exactly call that post-traumatic stress disorder, but something like that is happening because people who've been treated unfairly will just have these recurrent ideas about it. I know I talked to one of the diplomats. He was a spouse of a current foreign service officer. This guy held a very high position. He was the deputy chief of mission in a European country, which is second to the ambassador. And then he was acting as charge, which is like ambassadors out of town, and so this is a country that's kind of, this isn't the country, but it'd be like Germany or Brussels or Belgium or whatever. And so he got a call, and he said, the call was, I'm very sorry, you haven't been promoted this go-round. Your career in the Foreign Service is over because it's an up-or-out system, and thank you for your service. And he had to leave. And so he had to retire forcibly from the Foreign Service because he didn't get this promotion that he had to have. And he just could not get over that. He thought it was so unfair, and he just thought about it year after year. He had these chronic medical problems that he was dealing with, but it very much seemed to be related to the psychological stress of difficult leadership in a difficult organizational setting. So, here are these concepts. Then Steve touched on burnout, and I'll just briefly summarize what he touched on too. Then we'll talk a little, not long, about compassion fatigue, and then about vicarious traumatization. So burnout, I don't have that cool acronym, so I like that red, thing that Steve had. So it's all the same. Burnout is a tendency toward dissatisfaction with job accomplishments and emotional depletion at work, and then emotional detachment from colleagues, patients, clients, and customers. So when, obviously when a doctor's burned out, if your colleagues burn out, then they're just cynical about everything. They don't really seem to care about the patients anymore, and they used to, and you just know something is wrong. So that's burnout. Compassion fatigue is this notion that you get tired of doing good sometimes, and it kind of wears you down. Okay, so this is a concept in psychology that's probably been around for a couple of decades. So there's a difficulty in regenerating and renewing after engaging in emotional support of colleagues, clients, patients, or survivors. So this could be true of disaster relief work. It's just, I can't do this anymore. I saw that a lot after the East Africa bombings. And then an inability to successfully engage in activities that restore us. So you're not up to it. And of course, this could also be reflecting things like depression. So all these feelings of sorrow, suffering, or sympathy to the point of exhaustion, and it occurs in people with this strong desire to alleviate suffering. So these are, as people who started out well-meaning and just don't really have it anymore. And then vicarious traumatization. So this was one that really surprised me. So again, just look, I learned so much from these embassy bombings, but in the way the bombing happened, the people who were at the Agency for International Development building were in a different part of the city, so they weren't affected by the bombing. And then there were the people who were bombed, and some of those died and some were badly injured. So there was a lot of complaining when I got there, which was 16 months after the bombing, that the people who were at USAID were complaining like they had been in the bombing, okay? And they were saying, they were so much, concerned, and they were saying they weren't even there. What are they worried about? But then the more we got into it, the more you realize these were people who had seen, like one person had seen, like the brains of a friend on the, building that they constantly had to be showing VIPs, who came to look at the bombing. There were people who had to give news to loved ones whose relatives had died. And so they were not doing well. They were vicariously traumatized. And so that's where I learned this. At this time, this wasn't in the DSM at all. But the Red Cross people knew all about it. So it was a concept that was developed by a psychologist named Laurie Perlman in 1995. And it really has a lot of sort of face validity to it, and even though there's not a ton of research on it. But anyway, so with vicarious traumatization versus compassion fatigue, vicarious traumatization is something that would happen right after the event. So if you were in some sort of critical incident or something that happened, and you heard a lot of these stories, that's where the vicarious traumatization would occur. Whereas compassion fatigue is something that's more just from doing good for a long time. So, let's read this a little bit because I want to move on to resilience. So, now I want to talk about these concepts of hardiness, grit, and resilience. So we're going to move from, the sort of diagnosing to treating, okay? So each of these are psychological concepts. The first two relate to resilience, and I'm going to focus mainly on resilience. But hardiness is this concept developed by a psychologist, Kobasa is her name, and this is like what makes it people just do better. What is it about people? So the Navy SEALs are really interested in this. So, and these are the three characteristics of people who are hardy. They feel like they have control over their situation. So they're kind of in command. They have a high degree of commitment to what they're doing, and they can tolerate change well. Okay? So so just speaking personally, I usually feel like I have control over my circumstances. I'm committed to what I do, but I don't tolerate change that well. I like just things to be the same. So I'm maybe 2/3 hardy. But that's hardiness and whatever. And this guy, Paul Bartone, who's a psychologist at the National Defense University, has done a lot of work on it. Now, grit is another concept that's very useful. And so aside from being a delicious southern dish, grit is this concept of persistence plus passion, okay? So anybody know the book by Angela Duckworth on grit? Anyway, there's a bunch of YouTube videos and an interesting book by this psychologist Angela Duckworth on grit. So there's been research that says that a lot of people who have been successful NGO leaders have this quality of grit. So it's a little different than resilience because this is people who will persist and they're passionate about what they do. Okay? And then resilience is this concept of bouncing back and thriving under pressure. Now, if you look up a definition of resilience, you'll find that there are lots and lots of definitions of resilience, but they kind of fall along these lines. So what is it then about people that makes them able to bounce back, and why do people get interested in this in the first place? Well, the roots of resilience go back to the late 70s when psychiatrists and psychologists started looking at children of schizophrenics and other people who were raised in very disadvantaged circumstances. And you might think that, well, if your parent was a schizophrenic, that's like one of the worst things that could probably happen to you. And anyway, when you look at the kids of schizophrenics, they don't do as badly as you would predict. Okay, so they do about 50% have a lot more problems than others, and then another 50% don't. And so the researchers looked at, well, why was it that some of these kids did better? And that was one of the roots of the resilience research, what they found. The second was on workplace stress. So you may remember that back in the day, you could get this thing called the Holmes and Ray scale of stressful life events. So you go down and you check these boxes, and moving was bad, divorce is bad, death of a parent and so on. And you add up the score, and then if you have a high score, you might get colds more often, or you're more susceptible to disease. And of course, they're certainly true that if you're under stress, you can get that. But these are not consistent predictors of illness, okay? So some people don't. And so there was an interest in why do some people, have a lot of stressful life events but don't seem to do as badly as other people. And then there's the issue of traumatized individuals. So people who've studied veterans, and this is where a lot of this research comes from, have looked at the qualities of people who've been through combat or people who were in horrible accidents or whatever, and why did some of them do so much better than others? So I'm going to tell you in just a few minutes. So The resilience is the capacity to adapt successfully in the presence of risk and adversity and to bounce back from setbacks, trauma, and high stress. This is the definition we used at the Department of State. And we use this battery here, the battery analogy, because resilience fluctuates. It's considered to be both a trait, a psychological trait, and a state. It's a trait in the sense that, you know, some people are just born with a little bit more resilience than others, but it's a state, and then it fluctuates. You know, no matter how resilient you are, if you're under some kind of horrible leadership for 2 or 3 years in a row, or you're in some very, very unfair situation, you're not going to be able to bounce back so well after that. And we would see that a lot in these people in the State Department who served overseas in these very difficult embassy assignments, and they would get ground down. So I like to tie things into the Christian faith, and when I think of resilience, although I haven't found resilience in the Bible, okay, maybe in the Message, I'm not sure, but anyway. But it says, be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. So I think that sort of relates to resilience. And so low resilience, again, like stress, this really overlap with depression. But when people aren't resilient in a workplace, there's a lot of anxiety and fear. They're clingy and isolated. They may have a lot of minor illnesses, moody, emotionally labile, not able to sleep well, forgetful, feeling hopeless. This is low resilience. And I think it's really helpful if you're in a workplace where you think people are maybe suffering from a low resilience, to have a little talk with them about how to encourage them and so on, but that's what we're thinking about with low resilience. So here are the 10 resilience factors that are identified in this book by Southwick and Charney. So in fact, there are lots of resilience factors, and not just 10, but these are definitely things that are talked about a lot in the resilience literature. And if you look up psychological resilience on PubMed or something, you'll find that there's just a huge amount of information. So this is a concept people are interested in, and they're interested in it from A to Z. I mean, what I'm talking about here is more of a psychological notion of resilience, but there is a lot of neurobiology of resilience also. So Southwick and Charney, so these are two researchers who were at Yale at the time a lot of this research was done. And they summarized it in this book published in 2012 called Resilience, the Science of Mastering Life's Greatest Challenges. So they interviewed lots of people, and they came up with this, that people who were resilient had sturdy role models. So let's think about, like, as a Christian, of course, Christ is certainly our role model. More recently, you could think about people, just think about your, personal role model. I mean, I certainly have some. But, so they had sturdy role models. They were modeling themselves after somebody. It wasn't just all stuff that they were figuring out on their own. They also had this quality of cognitive flexibility. So this is the ability to kind of look at things from a different perspective. So what do you mean by this? Well, let's say humor. Okay, that would be cognitive flexibility, that you can look at it from more than one way. Or the idea of acceptance. The prayer, God grant us the ability to accept the things we, accept the things we cannot change, and change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's acceptance, okay? So I should memorize it better. But anyway. So, but that's cognitive flexibility, and then thankfulness, okay, is another, or gratitude. And in fact, this isn't just something that Christians talk about. You may have noticed. I mean, this is like, for whatever reason, the Buddhists are really into gratitude as well, which, we need other religions to affirm what we think, but anyway, and then another quality along these lines would be the ability to forgive. There's a fair amount of research on dispositional forgiveness, like an attitude of forgiveness toward others. So, and I think these are all things that demonstrate cognitive flexibility. The third is active problem solving. So people who were resilient were able to kind of get in there and like just do it. You know, they were like willing to take the bull by the horns and so on. They were people who were realistically optimistic. Now, optimism is a two-edged sword because it can be irritating, you know. And so we have, in fact, one of my colleagues back at the department, Beth Payne, she doesn't even like this optimism thing at all. She like survived this rocket attack in Baghdad and whatever, and she really thinks this is all baloney. But I don't agree. But it's realistic optimism, which is not the sort of Pollyanna type optimism where, oh, it's all don't worry. It's the optimism that looks at it and says, you know, this is hard, but I think there might be a way, and it kind of presses on that sort of optimism. People who are resilient tended to seek social support. Now, you know, doctors often aren't as good on social support, and because it's a little bit difficult to reach out. Probably, I'm guessing you all are probably in the upper percentiles of seeking social support because you actually are coming out to this and networking and so on. But I think it's not a trait you typically associate with doctors as sort of the chumminess and so on. But I think we can really benefit from seeking out social support from others, especially when we're in difficult times. The resilient people follow their own inner moral compass. So they were people who tried to do the right thing, and they sort of, in the middle of a disaster, a difficult time, they just kept their compass focused on north. This is another thing, that was controversial at the State Department, because people would really push back on this, and they would say, really? Are you really supposed to do this? I mean, shouldn't we, because in our rules, you're supposed to just do whatever they tell you or whatever. But this is like, this is what they found. This is what the research. And by the way, Southwick and Charney, it didn't appear to me to have any kind of Christian commitment at all. I think Charney is a secular Jewish person, and Southwick, I'm not sure. But anyway, we went up to visit them and talked to them a little bit one time. People who were resilient drew from religious and spiritual resources. Now, when people mention this, a lot of times in the secular context, they often will talk about yoga or something. But if you look at the resilience research, that isn't really the kind of spirituality they're talking about. They're talking about people who thought that God helped them through the difficult time. Okay, and in this book, Charney and Southwick talk about stories like this, where people just felt like during the flood or Katrina or whatever, God was there for them. That was a characteristic. They were people who attended to their physical, mental, and emotional well-being. So they exercised. They were disciplined on that. They were disciplined with their emotions. So they weren't people who were just losing it. So when I was trained in psychiatry, it was just after the Austin Powers era of psychiatry, where you're supposed to just kind of let it all hang out and all this kind of thing. And there was an era when it's like, if you're mad, just get mad, throw the dishes and all that. Well, that's not that good for you. That's been demonstrated, okay? So that just kind of raises your blood pressure and, whatever. And so people who are resilient are people who can control their temper. So they're not the surgeons who are, throwing the knife across the room and all that. And then people who were resilient were people who could identify meaning in adversity. So when something bad would happen, they didn't just feel like they were the flotsam and jetsam of the universe. They were people who thought, well, at the very least, I want to make sure this doesn't happen to somebody else again, or something like this. And then they were people who took responsibility for their own emotional well-being. So they're not constantly blaming other people for their problems. They're people who thought, well, this has happened, what can I do about it? And not just looking at others all the time. Now, as I thought about this as a Christian, I'm thinking, well, where's the Christian link? Because it seemed like there were some. And I noticed, first of all, that on inner moral compass and religious and spiritual resources, well, this is clearly something where I think someone who's a Christian who's following God and, not trying not to be part of the world, that we're going to have that inner moral compass and, drawing from our religious and spiritual resources, kind of goes without saying. But I also think there's some overlap here, because if you're doing that, you're probably also more able to find meaning in adversity. I mean, and then I was presenting this one time at in Juba. I do some contract work for USAID, and I was speaking to the local staff in Juba at USAID, and of course in South Sudan, they're very Christian as a rule. And so I was going through this list, and we said, which resilience resources have you found yourself using, and so on. And one guy spoke up and he said, well, for us, religious and spiritual, that's the most important. I mean, everything else is under God. And I thought, this guy has a real point. So I put this rainbow up here because if you think about this in a certain way, it can look a little bit too self-sufficient and so on. And I think as Christians, we have to understand this as all being under God. And in fact, religious and spiritual resources aren't number 7. They're in a different place. But anyway, I liked this guy's comment in South Sudan. So here's just pointing out that cognitive flexibility would involve gratitude, forgiveness, humor, acceptance, and so on. And then that probably helps you find meaning in adversity better, okay? And then social support. If you're going to your church, then you're going to be reinforcing your inner moral compass. You're going to be reinforcing your ability to draw from religious and spiritual resources and your ability to identify meaning in adversity. So, just to kind of show you how I feel like Christians may have an edge on this, I very much agree with Steve. And I haven't seen any research per se, on Christians being more resilient, but there's a lot of research on just the role of religion in helping people during adversity, and it's generally helpful. There can be a toxic religion that is not. You've probably seen this too, where people have sort of a punitive view of God that may be unwarranted. But anyway, so under social affiliation, that made me think of Hebrews 10:25, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, all the more as you see the day drawing near. So we're told to assemble as Christians. And I think it's easy, especially I think maybe sometimes in our communities that we're in, church sometimes can take a back seat to a sense of Bible reading and personal relationship. But I would say if we're going to be, sort of focused on what God's Word says, we need to keep that in mind. Here's cognitive flexibility. Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you, from 1 Thessalonians 5. So that's just thankfulness. And then the inner moral compass. The aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart, in a good conscience, and a sincere faith. So this love is supposed to be the thing that drives us, not just sort of self-interest and so on. And then meaning in adversity, from Ephesians 3, of this gospel I was made a minister, to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages in God, who created all things. So there's this hidden purpose of God. And things can seem so bleak sometimes, but I think if we have our Christian thinking cap on, we can see ways around this, even in very dark times. Okay, so I mentioned that resilience isn't really mentioned in the Bible, but this other concept which I think relates to resilience is, and that is the concept of endurance. So endurance is the idea that you are going to just continue regardless. Okay, so if you think about the classical Christian virtues, or the classical virtues of justice, temperance, and fortitude, and so on, well, endurance falls under fortitude. Okay, it means standing fast, and expectation, and waiting. So you're going to just continue. Like, it's going to be hard, but you're supposed to continue. And then, this is coming from this theological dictionary of the New Testament, endurance is motivated by unselfish love and honor. So it's not just persisting in anything, it's persisting in a godly thing. So the word in the New Testament for this is upomone. My brother teaches Greek, and I was saying hypomone, and he told me to quit saying that because it's upomone, so I'm just saying that. But anyway, so here's the sense of endurance in Psalm 37:7. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. That would be the endurance. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. So I think there's endurance in one circle and resilience in another, and then there's some overlap between this. Here's another illustration of what the Bible means when it tells us to endure. This is from Luke 8:15, and this is the parable of the sower, and it's talking about the good seed. As for that in the good soil, they are those who, hearing the word, hold it fast in an honest and good heart, and bear fruit with patience. And that word is upomone. So they bear fruit with patient endurance. So you just keep on doing it. So again, in our work as physicians, we're under all these financial pressures. We're, threatening lawsuits, whatever it is. God is telling us, well, continue in your good works with patient endurance. Luke 21:17-19. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls. So it's just, again, this is the Lord speaking, so we need to take it seriously. Now, here's a verse or a passage I really like in 2 Corinthians where Paul talks about enduring in the things that he experienced. And it kind of goes in some interesting directions. So first of all, he talks about these difficult things, then he talks about some good things, and then he does some contrast. So 2 Corinthians 6:4-10, but as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way, through great endurance, in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labor, sleepless nights, hunger. So much for the prosperity gospel. Okay? By purity. So he's enduring in purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, and genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God, with weapons of righteousness for the right hand and the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute, in ill repute and good repute. So we're in a time now when our reputations may become tarnished because we are Christians. I mean, we see this happening. We are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet are well known, as dying and see. We are alive, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything. Okay, so this is the fruit of resilience. This is kind of of endurance. This is what we're called to. And then here's another passage that I think is very helpful. This is in Romans. Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. So I'll work this out a little bit. So we get the suffering. And then after the suffering is producing endurance. So we don't go straight to hope in this little scheme. We go to endurance. Okay, so we're sticking with it. Okay, I'm just going to do what God wants me to do here. And then that builds our character. Okay, then with this Christian character, we're experiencing a sense of hope in God. And then hope will not disappoint because God's love is poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. So I'm thinking resilience, building this resilience that we've talked about, using these resilience factors, trying to think it through, what are we not doing that we could do better, that can help us with our Christian endurance, and that's something God really calls us to. So just as we close, I wanted to mention that I found it very, very helpful to use the Psalms as a way of helping me think resiliently. So I would like to challenge you to get into the habit of reading in the Psalms every day, okay? And I actually have some little cards that will help you with this if you want to see me after. I have adopted this plan of reading the Psalms every 30 days, okay? And there's the Book of Common Prayer has a little system for doing this. The problem with reading a Psalm every day is Psalm 119, okay? Because you kind of get choked on that big bite. And so it divides Psalm 119 up and it evenly scatters the rest of them through. But anyway, I would encourage you to do this because if you'll read the Psalms carefully, you'll find that they encapsulate a lot of Christian experience. And so for your patients or you who feel like, well, I must not be living in the Lord because I'm just having all these adversities, or I feel this way, or whatever, how could God be with me? The Psalms can very much encourage you. So the Psalms can help us voice the unutterable. So if you read Psalm 88, it's a very sad psalm. He talks about, that he's been abandoned, the darkness is his friend, and so on. And yet it opens with this, the only optimistic note in it at all is in the beginning verse, which says, "O Lord God of my salvation, when at night I cry out in your presence." But becoming familiar with these, not just reading them when you're in trouble, but having them as part of your thinking, can be quite helpful. Psalm 44 is a psalm that talks about how God had helped them in the past, and then he seems to be gone now. And what's the problem? Where did you go? And that's another one to kind of think about a lot. Psalm 77 is another one. So I think Christian will often think, how can I think this? Like if I were truly a person of faith, I wouldn't have these doubting things. And yet I contend that the Psalms are the prayer book of the Bible. They're inspired prayers. You could look at it as the only part of the Bible where it's in what is said to God is inspired. So most of the Bible is God speaking to us. In the Psalms, they're inspired prayers to say to God. And I think I have pretty good warrant for this. I won't go into it, but if you want to convince yourself quickly, just remember that when Jesus was on the cross, and when he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" He was quoting Psalm 22:1, okay? And when he said, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit," he was quoting Psalm 31:5. So he's praying the Psalms in his distress in this way. So if Jesus can pray with these Psalms, I think he's setting an example for us. And here's Psalm 42 and 43. St. Augustine says that this is the psalm that people would say in the ancient church when they were joining the church and being baptized. So they would say those two psalms. And then there's psalms talking about waiting on the Lord during periods of discouragement. And then there's these wonderful psalms about being still. So Psalm 46, I'm sure you know this verse, Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge." So just finally, I want to draw your attention to Psalm 145, verse 13 and 14. And it says, "Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom." So when we're in this sort of America, we don't know whether, is Trump good or bad, or the world seems to be falling apart, are we going to have a nuclear war? Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures throughout all generations. The Lord is faithful in all his words and gracious in all his deeds. In fact, in the Damascus Mosque, a lot of the mosques in the Middle East, they're converted churches. This verse is actually engraved in stone around the edge of an upper part of the Damascus Mosque, okay, which used to be a Byzantine church. Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures throughout all generations. The Lord is faithful in all his words and gracious in all his deeds. The Lord upholds all who are falling. So this mighty God upholds all who are falling and raises up all who are bowed down. So that's the resilience piece of this. So, just to summarize, I'm thinking The practice of the Christian faith provides opportunities for us to practice resilience, and fostering resilience in ourselves under God could enable us to better support and foster resilience in the church. So, thank you. Okay, any questions? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, no, very much agree. And a lot of times people, he's saying that in Viktor Frankl's book, you talk Man's Search for Meaning, that it seems, he points out, through his concentration and camp experiences, that the idea of meaning and ability to find meaning in things undergirds everything. And sometimes you'll read in literature that man is a meaning-making creature. I think that's sort of a postmodern thing, to be honest. I think we're a meaning-identifying creature, okay? I don't think we're making it. I think we're identifying, we're finding it, Yes?
So you pointed out leadership contributing to PTSD. Any good leadership contributing to resilience?
Absolutely. That's a very perceptive implied observation, okay, which is that there's a concept of vicarious resilience, okay, so that if you are around resilient people, you are likely to become more resilient yourself, and certainly good leadership can be great. So we would back in the State Department, my boss Ray Leckie, he ran the ambassadorial seminar, like they call it charm school for the ambassadors, to try to train them and so on. And so he was very interested in what was good and bad leadership, because you'd hear both stories. And he was surprised that you would get some people back from these horrible assignments, like horrible places where they were serving, like let's say Lahore, Pakistan, for instance, where you're just under threat, you're locked down and all that. And people would say it was great. And it was like, well, what was the deal? It's my best assignment ever. Why? Well, it's the guy he was serving under and the leadership. The leaders would do what they told people. They themselves would set an example. They weren't looking down on people and so on. Whereas you can be in places, and I've covered these places, Luxembourg is an example, where, this looks like a thing out of a Disney cartoon, but we had a political appointee ambassador there who made it horrible, and people were curtailing to take Afghanistan assignments. Just saying. Yes.
Just one point to Lana's question. Tate Shanafelt, who I'm sure you know and many in the audience know, and who's probably the most published researcher in the field of wellness and burnout for physicians. One of his papers at Mayo showed that as the leadership profile in an organization or a department improves, burnout scores in the members of the department go down.
Yeah, I'm sure that's
So,
true.
yeah.
Oh, just as the Tate Shannonfeld has done this research that shows that as leadership improves in a medical department, rates of burnout fall significantly, and I'm absolutely sure that's right. So. Yes.
I love the Psalms. We have any artists that you like that sing Lamentations very well.
Do I have? Well.
No, because
Do I have artists that?
you will pop in the CD or on your.
Okay, so it's a little. Again, I'm a psychiatrist, so this is a little peculiar. But I like the. There's a whole series. So the Book of Common Prayer, often is sung like in an evensong, and so you can download all the songs as sung by these cathedral choirs in England. Okay, so I've downloaded them all. And so you can listen to those, and if you can read, the first few times you don't understand the words, sort of thing, but if you get the Book of Common Prayer and read along with it, you get to where you understand them. I find that a very good experience. So.
Along those same lines, there's a guy named Michael Tyrell who did 12 years of research on different sound frequencies, and he has this thing called whole tones, and he researched the frequencies that David would have used on his instruments in the Bible to console Saul when he was going
Cool.
through mental breakdowns. And so Michael Tyrell whole tones, it's something that really helps.
Michael Tyrell whole tones. He recreated David's tones for Saul. Okay. All right. Yes.
Steve mentioned in his lecture that the doctors that burn out, number one, primary care, and number two, females. So female primary care is pretty bad off, potentially.
Okay.
But then he listed the least burnt out professions, and psychiatry, dermatology, among a few others. The psychiatry wasn't there. So we as primary care, we listen to people's problems all day long. You as a psychiatrist, you listen to people's problems all day long. How come we get burnt out and you don't?
Well, probably because we're mainly getting paid for doing it. Yes?
I know you mentioned a couple already, and there's so many to choose from, but what are the top books that you would recommend on this topic of resilience?
Of resilience, it would really be the Southwick and Charney book, which is Resilience, and I can't remember the subtitle, but it's Cambridge University Press, published in 2012. And I like it because it's not simply a textbook. You know, it's written for kind of educated lay people, or people like us who don't want to really be reading a textbook, and so. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Oh, what?